Episode 217, Chaos Gardening, Part 1. This is the World Organic News for the week ending 8th of June 2020. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. The great philosophical battles over time were reduced to two teams in the seminal spy show of the 1960s, Get Smart. Control and chaos were the two options. Much industrial farming and chemically based gardening can be thought of as part of the control team. After all, we have several millennia of holy books declaring humanity's need to bring order and structure to chaotic nature. That these books arose in the cultural context of West Asia, known nowadays as the Middle East, it should not be a surprise that this approach should be the bedrock of Western, in inverted commas, farming. Nature is considered corrupt in some way, less than perfect. If we look to other systems of belief, say that of the fisher hunter-gatherer, we see a different viewpoint. Nature is considered perfect already. If you'd like to delve more deeply into this dichotomy, I would recommend reading Joseph Campbell, or at least view the Bill Moyers interviews with Campbell, link in the show notes. The point I am eventually getting to is biomimicry. Because nature has already solved most problems we faced in food production, it doesn't matter what your religious or lack of religious viewpoint is, our cultures carry the inertia of those foundation myths, and these can make us blind to what actually is happening in nature. And so for this reason it can be difficult to get a handle on the different ideas. So the point of the chaos gardens is that they most closely resemble nature, and getting our heads around this and the word chaos can be a struggle. Hopefully what follows will make the system more obvious and, dare I say it, preferable. So away we go. From the US, a movement appears to have begun and is developing momentum. Related surprisingly to the whole COVID thing and the long supply lines in the developed world's food systems and the shortages that have occurred. From a Civil Eats article dated the 12th of May 2020 entitled "Most farmers in the Great Plains don't grow fruits and vegetables. The pandemic is changing that." Quote, Tom Cannon, he's a corn/soybean grower, for one, is planting 6 acres of vegetables. He calls it a chaos garden and it's essentially a cover crop, a crop that is planted between cash crops. But while a standard cover crop may contain alfalfa, that's loosened in the rest of the world outside the US, ryegrass or sorghum, that can be used for building soil organic matter or grazing, a chaos seed mix might include peas, squash, radish, okra, melons, sweet corn, and other edible plants. In other words, it contains groceries, end quote. You will notice, I hope, the greater diversity in the chaos cover crop compared to the standard model. Now, as far back as the mid-1970s, John Moore in the Complete Book of Self-Sufficiency, link in the show notes, was advocating complex cover crop rotations. His system relied upon the cover crops being a herbal ley or complex pasture system, which he grazed between cash crops to grow fertility into the soil before turning it under to grow spuds, root crops, legumes and cereals. But the idea was there. And from my reading, it appears that this idea has been around since the 1700s, so it's nothing new in one sense. The difference now is the use of vegetable crops as the primary seeds in the cover crop. The bonuses of these cover crops are many and varied. They are creating new markets for the growers, they are feeding people outside the food system, or the industrialised food system, and they have remarkable soil carbon and photosynthetic effects. More on those last two later. Another quote from the Civil Eats piece. Quote, "It's the perfect way for a commodity farmer like Cannon to grow fruits and vegetables without changing farming practices." Says Cannon, "I just load my drill," that's his seed planter, "with 50 plus species and don't ever go back until it's time to harvest. Cannon plans to let community members pick their own produce. After the people get everything they want, you turn out cattle onto the field. Whatever remains serves as a green manure to fertilise the soil." End quote. Sort of a variation on the medieval strip system where each household had a section of the rows in a paddock to grow what they wanted, or perhaps were allowed to grow within cultural norms. This chaos green crop makes economic sense. With 50 different cultivars, some will outgrow others, shading them, smothering them, and others will thrive. But something will grow no matter what the season is. Either way, more diversity is added to the soil. Whether or not these seeds will be a problem in the future crops remains to be seen. The key, I suspect, is the succession of the 6 acres of the piece. Grow, people harvest, stock harvest, remains returned to the soil. We could leave out the people and still achieve the same effect, but why not have the human element involved? People picking their own food reconnects individuals with the soil, the food, and with nature, so win-win-win. And a little further on from the Civil Eats article, quote, in addition to planting, other benefits of a chaos approach are the blanket of plants crowded out most unwanted species, including weeds. The cucumbers and squash and other flowering plants attract beneficial insects that keep pests like squash bugs at bay. The dense foliage increases soil moisture retention and reduces the need to water. And the plants tend to mature at different rates, allowing for several months of a diverse bounty, rather than a monocrop that gets harvested all at once. End quote. This sounds very much like a semi-fisher hunter-gatherer approach to food, harvesting things as they ripen across time on the same piece of land, hence the utility of the U-pick model. The entire system certainly appeals to me. For a more conventional sales system where produce is collected from the fields and sold elsewhere, even at the farm shop, I can see increased time issues and labour costs, but nothing is insurmountable. Now to the soil carbon and photosynthetic benefits. Clearly, with the chaos system described above, much organic matter will be returned to the soil whilst keeping the soil covered, both carbon sequestration positive activities. But wait, there's more. From a piece called Light Farming, Restoring Carbon, Organic Nitrogen and Biodiversity to Agricultural Soils by Christine Jones, PhD. Quote, imagine there was a process that could remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, replace it with life-giving oxygen, support a robust soil microbiome, regenerate topsoil, enhance the nutrient density of food, restore water balance to the landscape and increase the profitability of agriculture. Fortunately, there is. It's called photosynthesis. End quote. Yeah, photosynthesis. Further quote. In the miracle of photosynthesis, a process that takes place in the chloroplasts of green leaves, carbon dioxide, CO2, from the air and water, H2O from the soil, are combined to capture light energy and transform it to biochemical energy in the form of simple sugars. These simple sugars, commonly referred to as photosynthate, are the building blocks of life in and on the earth. Plants transform sugar to a great diversity of other carbon compounds, including starches, proteins, organic acids, cellulose, lignin, waxes and oils. End quote. So far, so early secondary school biology class, but wait, etc., etc. The point is, photosynthesis is related to not just sugar production. While each plant creates its own needs as it creates sugars, it also draws upon the sugars created by other plants. The great balancing effect required is beneath the surface of the soil. The interconnection between plants is based upon their variety and their symbiotic relationships with soil microbiota. As a general rule of thumb, and that means there will be exceptions to this rule, but the more an ecosystem's soil produces annuals, the greater the need for bacterial soil organisms. The woodier the above-ground ecosystem is, the greater the number of mycelia required, with the same number of bacteria as annuals need. By denuding soil of their carbon content, we are effectively killing off the soil's microbiome, and this has consequences. Quote, soil dysfunction also impacts on human and animal health. It is sobering to reflect that over the last 70 years, the level of every nutrient in almost every kind of food has fallen between 10 and 100%. An individual today would need to consume twice as much meat, 3 times as much fruit and 4 to 5 times as many vegetables to obtain the same amount of minerals and trace elements as available to those same foods in 1940. And from a little further along in the article, it is commonly believed that the significant reduction in the nutrient density of today's chemically produced food is due to the dilation effect. That is, as yield increases, mineral content falls. However, compromised nutrient levels are not observed in high-yielding vegetables, crops and pastures grown in healthy, biologically active soil. Indeed, the opposite applies." End quote. So, what's to be done? Clearly we need to get more carbon back into the soil. I don't know, decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil, for instance. Dr. Jones recommends using the photosynthetic process of plants as our aid. But to do that, we need to understand the carbon cycle, which she goes on to explain. Quote, "Soil can function as a carbon source, adding carbon to the atmosphere, or a carbon sink, removing CO2 from the atmosphere. The dynamics of the source-link equation are largely determined by land management. Over millennia, a highly effective carbon cycle has evolved, in which the capture, storage, transfer, release and recapture of biochemical energy in the form of carbon compounds repeats over and over. The health of the soil and the vitality of the plants, animals and people depends on the effective functioning of this cycle." End quote. The best way it appears to achieve a healthy functioning carbon cycle is to have as wide a variety of plants in a given area as possible. Thus, the practice of ploughing between perennials, say grapevines or apple trees and so on, to avoid competition is a no-no. Instead, we should be planting as wide a variety of plants as possible, flowers included. I am inclined towards edible flowers in the mix simply because poisoning people is not a real good business model, especially if they're going to be harvesting themselves. And I'm looking to follow people with pigs and poultry before I replant, so edible is essential. Chaos gardens may, in reality, be just what's needed to fix the soil microbiome, animal and human health, and reverse the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. The harvesting for human consumption does not lend itself to tractor-based methods, but to human-scale, hands-on approaches. So just imagine every nature strip in suburbia sown to chaos gardens. Imagine a trip to the greengrocers as a walk to the footpath, verge, sidewalk or whatever word you use where you are. Imagine parts of the public green space in urban areas turned over to these gardens, where unit dwellers could forage for food. Just imagine the changes we could effect with these gardens. Makes this cynical old person smile with wonder. The good doctor has some principles for restarting the carbon cycle as she was designed. I'll cover these next week in what I'm creatively calling Part 2. As I've mentioned in the past episodes, there's a link to a Udemy course in the show notes entitled Growing a No-Dig Garden, if you'd like some more formal assistance in your gardening. Or you can also go or send people to episode 207, where I discuss growing a quick response garden to get yours up and happening quickly. Even if it's a little bit later into the season, you can still plant stuff that will get your food back fairly quickly. Remember, in this unusual time, if we put in the groundwork now, we can all change the world, even if it's only a little bit to start with. And once we do that, we will begin the process of decarbonising the air and recarbonising the soil. Thank you one and all for listening. I'll be back next week.